one thing that really strikes me about that piece is it's this attempt to visualize things that would otherwise be invisible.
This sort of dance between destruction and beauty, I think, is really interesting.
All of this, like he basically started working at the intersection of art, science, technology, environmentalism.
It's just so relevant because we as humans haven't really acknowledged or solved any of the problems that we've created.
Metzger's entire beginning is at the very beginning of like the Second World War and how the world changed. So by 1945, he was in Cambridge, he was a gardener, and he started going to art school. So 1945 is when the first atomic bomb went off. And he's in Cambridge, and you know what Cambridge is like, from reputation, if nothing else. That's basically like, because of the university, there's this it's the hotbed of where so many discussions around science were going on, particularly about the atomic era and what was dawning. And so Metzger started at art school at the same time as going along to tons of lectures about science and the atom bomb and all sorts of things like that. So from the very beginning, Metzger did not see a separation. It was impossible to see a separation, one from art and life, but also from art and science. And he became super aware of the fact that it's also impossible to not have damage to the environment and impact on human nature without, with war and with the kind of developments, the way that like humans were developing science into weapons. And so all of this, like he basically started working at the intersection of art, science, technology, environmentalism at the very beginning.
I mean, I'm really drawn to the early video piece where he's painting with acid. I have like conflicting feelings with the material because he's contributing to, with the car piece as well, like the pollution. But then I think about how we were talking about how it's sort of visualizing this thing that's invisible, and I think that's important. And I think artists have the only permission, like out of everyone, artists have the permission to sort of show those things. And this sort of dance between destruction and beauty, I think, is really interesting, and how we're attracted to like maybe violent or destructive things.
I just had a question about the earliest piece, the first video. You mentioned that it was like the 1960s he made it. I just finished the book, The Silent Spring, and it talks about like the 1950s, decade earlier, about the pesticides and herbicides that were like sprayed on the U.S. I'm wondering if like that was like also correlation, like the use of acid or anything, if he was part of that pesticide movement, like against pesticides and herbicides.
It's interesting because we did a conversation in New York, because there's a book that just came out that's outside, you can check it out later, and it's basically 15 years of conversations between Gustav Metzger and the curator Hans-Ulrich Obrist, who is the director at the Serpentine, which is a museum in London. And he's this dude, he goes into conversation with artists forever. He'll never just interview them once. Every time he goes back into town, wherever they are, if he's interested in them, he'll interview them again. So he did this with Metzger for 15 years. So this book is a compilation of all these interviews. So we launched this book in New York with Joan Jonas, the artist, and she brought up exactly the same book. So Metzger was in, like, at the time when he was doing it, he was part of this committee of the 100, which is this radical move. They kept getting arrested because they were like anti-nuclear, the beginning of the anti-nuclear movements. And I don't know whether he spent time to think about pesticides and everything else. He was always thinking very like neurally, like lots in a kind of networked way.
It's interesting to think about how maybe we do the opposite, that it's not so much the physical, but with the idea of what we're trying to convey. We don't have to hold on to things as tightly. It's an interesting way to think of your work, that it can be a concept, not a physicality.
I believe that the true work of creation contains the seeds of the own destruction.
The true work of creation contains the seed of destruction. And when you think about, like, the atom bomb, you think about 1945, you think about Hiroshima, you know, and all of those, we've seen so many of those films now, but it's like the creating of the atomic age and everything that it brought us that could be positive, and within that there is this destruction, and the whole idea of creation and destruction being the same thing. I mean, it's kind of like incredible to think how long that resonance has gone on for. It still makes sense today. The idea of auto-creation and auto-destruction, and that you can't have one without the other. Well, maybe you could, but we don't have it.
So for me, being introduced to Metzger, I think his work really stands out because for a while I could not see myself like destroying my artwork, but now I can see that being a part of my artistry. I think we have so much sentiment attachment to ephemeral objects, and as a painter, what I create, you know, it's a part of me, but you know, that's old phases of me and my different parts of me I can let go, and so I just see that now.
I guess as artists, we really hold on to what we're making.
I mean, the fact that we haven't solved a lot of our environmental problems he's so relevant. I mean, the fact that his piece about the cars and just the buildup of the carbon dioxide, and the piece mention of like the flower piece on top of the car and how fast those plants are dying because of the car exhaust. It's so significant now, especially with our obsession of the car and like infrastructure. It's just so relevant because we as humans haven't really acknowledged or solved any of the problems that we've created.
One thing that really strikes me about that piece is it's this attempt to visualize things that would otherwise be invisible, or like ways of sort of environmental damage that would otherwise be invisible. And there's a kind of frustration there, right? Like the way in which we've talked about the environment has changed from focusing on like individual actions to focusing on things like environmental racism, and different ways of understanding how that damage is allocated and who's responsible for it and by what mechanisms, that this seems to speak to in complex ways.
So there is, Charles Gaines said this, not me. Charles was part of a sustainability conference that we did here about a year ago. And he was saying it's really interesting, like being an artist talking about the environment is pretty complex. This visuality, I think, was super important to him, and it's been overlooked because a lot of people who have been interested in presenting his work before have been interested in the activism. But the activism for Metzger, I think, is something that he did in parallel, but he really wanted his work to be seen as something.
I think his work is relevant as the earth is only getting more polluted with time. If anything, I think Metzger is hot right now. My generation cares more than other generations. I was just thinking about, politically, our government doesn't even care. The candidates that we've been electing, that's not their priority, and it should be, because who are you going to govern if there's nothing left? So I think he's relevant right now with environmentalism, as, you know, my generation is probably going to be the one, and maybe even the generation after, like if we instill it in our kids to actually care about climate change and the state of the earth. And yeah, I don't know if you've seen that whole climate clock thing that's like we have 5 years. Yeah, I mean, I think Metzger should have been bigger in the prior generation, but at least it's doing something right now and with the kids at CalState LA.
So Gustav often stated that it's not enough to talk about the climate change because we'll never wake up. We have to talk about extinction. So what are some calls to action that you see throughout the show that sets up these call to actions for you all, because you are the next generation of artists?
What strikes me is the like urban environment that I see around in all the works, and the way that he doesn't avoid machinery or these sort of man-made objects, which is interesting. I don't always see like ecological work being spoken through those kinds of materials. So it's sort of like not shying away from where we are right now and
like, you know, putting us into the present moment.
It's interesting how material the exhibition is for a dude that was happy to have things ephemeral. But it's all just bits of material. And then it's like, and there is something interesting about, like, I mean, this wasn't his urban environment. Urban environments in general, the way that we've got rid of the forests and the like areas that we can actually like naturally survive in, being able to like take the material of our environment and turn it into something that's like, it's kind of like alchemy, isn't it?
Yeah, I wanted to say that it feels like he has a love affair with these machines and materials, which is interesting. Like he obviously really likes them and finds them beautiful.
We went to the Hammer recently, and Yang Kura is an artist from Korea, and they basically make trash monsters. And so he's gathering all the trash in his environment and depicting this, you know, these new like deities of his time, of our times. And so I think that's just,
Those works are incredible, aren't they?
yeah, they're incredible. And so I just think about how, you know, we have this new wave of artists coming in, and just that's the new story of like activism of our time is just trash and, you know, the toxicity that's grown in our environment. And so I watched a Netflix movie, By Now, The Shopping Conspiracy, and it's just like how we have all this trash everywhere, and it's like it's not going away, you know? And so it just makes me think like he was one of the beginning artists of that, and just foreshadowing of our current time.
And I think that's important to keep in mind, that we're not just here not making an impact, and that everything we do creates a ripple effect in some way. And just being more intentional, maybe for myself, like coming out of the show, just being more intentional with everything, and not to a point of like anxiety, but to a point where there's intention behind every move. And I think we all just want to live in like a better place and not be afraid of the future.